and welcome everyone to our weekly session of reading of the Bitcoin Optech newsletter. And in this session, we'll be covering newsletter number 284, published on 10th of January 2024. So this week's newsletter is primarily bifurcated into a section that is dedicated to news, and the second section, which contains a monthly activity, which is a Bitcoin Core PR review club and some questions pertaining it. So instead of the Bitcoin Stack Exchange questions, this time we have questions from the Bitcoin Core PR review club. And then we have notable code and documentation changes as every week. So the news section is pretty massive this week. We'll start with the news section, and I'll be reading and I'll highlight whatever passage I'm reading through. This week's newsletter summarizes discussion about LN anchors and elements of the V3 transaction relay proposal and announces a research implementation of LN symmetry. Also included are our regular sections with the summary of Bitcoin Core, a PR review club meeting, and the description of notable changes to popular Bitcoin infrastructure software. So we commence with the news section, which is interconnected. It's massive and it's interconnected, but I'll try and break it into pieces when I'm reading. And then we can discuss. Discussion about LN anchors in V3 transaction relay proposal. Antoine Ponsor posted to Delving Bitcoin to foster discussion about the proposals for V3 transaction relay policy and ephemeral anchors. The thread appears to have been motivated by Peter Todd posting a critique of V3 relay policy on his blog. We've arbitrarily divided the discussion into several parts. Here's the first part. Frequent use of exogenous fees may risk mining decentralization. An ideal version of the Bitcoin protocol would reward each miner proportionately to their hash rate. The implicit fees paid in transactions preserve that property. A miner with 10% of total hash rate has a 10% chance of capturing a next block fee, whereas a miner with 1% of hash rate has a 1% chance. Fees paid outside of transactions and directly to miners called out-of-band fees violate that property. A system that pays miners together control over 55% of hash rate has a 99% chance of getting a transaction confirmed within 6 blocks, likely resulting in little effort being made to pay small miners of 1% or less hash rate. If small miners are paid proportionately less than large miners, mining will naturally centralize, which will reduce the number of entities that need to be compromised in order to censor which transactions get confirmed. Actively used protocols such as LN
How
penalty
does
and
does
penalty.
anyone know how
Yeah,
does this out of band fees work? Like how is it possible for big mining pools to collect extra fees? I did not know about it. So if you can elaborate or share how does it
yeah,
that work?
sure. So basically, there's an endogenous fee, and there's an exogenous fee, and there's an out-of-bound fee. What's an endogenous fee? It's the default mechanism of paying fee in a Bitcoin transaction. That is the difference between the inputs and the outputs, right? So when you're curating a transaction and the input is worth 1 Bitcoin, and the output is worth 0.9 Bitcoin. So that difference of 0.1 Bitcoin is implied fee. You don't have to stipulate it somewhere. That is implied by the system that the input minus the output is the fee that you're paying to the miner. That directly goes to the miner who mines the transaction or who successfully gets the block mined. Okay, so this is the endogenous fee, or also referred to as the implied fee or implicit fee. And we've all done this during our LBTCL cohort. And this is known to everyone. The second mechanism is exogenous fee. Exogenous fee can be in multiple ways. It can be CPF fee, child paying for a transaction, where you broadcast a transaction which has a very low mining fee, due to which the transaction is not getting included in a block because the miners are not intrigued enough or interested enough in your transaction. In this situation, you have an avenue of adding a child to that parent transaction, and the only purpose of this child is bumping the fee and thereby incentivizing the miners. So this is exogenous fee, meaning your original transaction did not have adequate fee to incentivize the miners, so you used an external mechanism. That could be RBF, such that you create an entirely new transaction. That could be CPFP, such that you attach a child transaction to bump the fee. And it could also be you calling a miner whom you know personally and paying them through a credit card, a debit card, Bitcoin, giving them some favor, whatever. So it's also possible that you know a miner and you just broadcasted a transaction with a very low fee, and none of the miners are interested in it. So you contact a miner, just give them a call, you know them personally, and you tell them, hey, I'll transfer whatever $50, $100 in your account. or I'll give you some favor, or I'll pay you bitcoins, or I'll pay you over Lightning, whatever favor it could be, and then you incentivize that miner to include your transaction in the block. So this payment is not happening on the Bitcoin network. This is also a mechanism of exogenous fee. Outer band fees is basically the difference between the implied fee and the or the endogenous fee and the exogenous fee. So let's say your transaction has a fee of 10,000 sats, which is very low. The estimated fee is higher than that. So you maybe create a CPFP, or you give whatever cash to a miner. So the difference between the implied endogenous and the exogenous fee is outer band fee. So
That's
broadly, we
very
have
well
three kinds of fees.
that's very well explained, Fazil. So I could understand, like, when we directly contact the miners, incentivize them, that there will be some difference and that would directly accrue to the bigger mining pools. But like in case of CPFP or RBF, I do not understand, like how does that make it exogenous fee? Because even those ones will make it to the the any miner who will mine my transaction, right? So even the smaller ones could have gotten that. Anyone who will basically mine it will get it, isn't that so?
Right. So exogenous fee does not necessarily refer to you paying the miner outside the Bitcoin network. You might even pay the miner inside the Bitcoin network. But what you are doing is you are not using the implied fee. Okay. The fee that you are paying, let's talk about CPFP. Now the fee that you are paying in CPFP is not the input minus the output of the parent transaction, right? When the fee is input minus output, it is endogenous fee. When the fee is input minus output of the parent transaction plus the fee of the child transaction, that is exogenous fee, meaning you're doing something extra additional than what the default mechanism is to
Okay.
incentivize the miners.
Okay.
All right, and yeah, the broad query is that I mean the broad criticism is that this can lead to centralization of mining, because I mean, if you had to call someone a miner and pay them to include your transaction in a block, you're obviously not going to call someone who has a 1% hash rate, because in implied fee or endogenous fee, your fee will only be redeemed when the transaction has been mined successfully. But in case of an like a payment that you make outside the network, whether your transaction gets mined or no is irrelevant. You will have to pay the miner upfront. So you will call a miner that has some, or any miner irrelevant of the hash rate, and you will pay them upfront. Only if you pay them upfront will they commit to including your transaction in a block. So there might be a possibility that even though they have a high hash rate, they might still not be able to include your block in the your transaction in the next 6 blocks or 10 blocks or whatever. So like there is a high risk in this case, because your money is going upfront and there is absolutely no guarantee that your transaction will be mined. So in this case, obviously you'll go with the miner that has a high hash rate, so that the possibility or the permutation of your transaction being included in the block is high. What this will do is this will push out small miners from the mining network, because I mean, this will kind of consolidate all the exogenous fees going to the miners that have a high hash rate, and then the small miners will not have any incentive, and they will be forced out of the network, because they're investing computational power and electric energy and they're not getting anything in return. So obviously they'll shut their ASIC machines, and this will consolidate the mining operations. And then what that would make is that it would make censoring transactions pretty easy, because people with authority know that there are 4, 5, 6 big players that control a majority of the hash rate. So if they want to censor any transaction, they just need uh, to make these 5 or 6 guys compromise. So this is broadly the criticism of out of bound fees. And if you go through the entire article, I'll just finish it. Focusing on a thought experiment version of Helen that uses P2R and proposed ephemeral anchors, Peter argues that its dependency on exogenous fees significantly incentivizes paying out of band fees. In particular, the unilateral close of a channel with no pending payments, HTLCs would allow a large miner accepting out of bound fees to include twice as many closed transactions in a block as an could be included by a small miner who only accepted in-band fees paid through CPFP fee bumping. The large miner could profitably encourage this by offering a moderate discount to users paying out of band. Peter Todd calls that a threat to decentralization. The post does suggest that some uses of exogenous fees in protocols is acceptable, so the concern may be about the frequency of their expected use and the relative price difference because between using them and paying out of band. In other words, frequently occurring zero pending unilateral closes with 100% overhead would likely be considered more of a risk than potentially rarer unilateral closes with 20 pending HTLCs where the overhead is less than 10%. So along with, I mean, we just covered what are the drawbacks of out of band fees, but there are also some benefits of out of band fees, and that is that it can save a lot of data. Because what happens is, let's say you broadcast a transaction that has a low fee. Now you want to bump the fee to ensure that the transaction gets included in a block. Now you have two alternatives: either to bump the fee on the Bitcoin network, and the second would be to bump the fee outside the Bitcoin network by contacting the miner and offering them some favor. In some situations, ironically, the latter situation might be preferred. What would be the reason? The reason is, let's say that I and Shian both have a Bitcoin transaction that is languishing in the mempool. It has a low transaction fee, and nobody is willing to include that transaction in a block. Now, Shian decides to do a CPF fee. He attaches a child transaction, adds a decent fee to the child, and thereby incentivizes the miner. I take the other route. I call the miner and I pay him in US dollars, and I tell him to include my transaction in his block. Now, what happens is that even though I am making a payment outside the network, and this might lead to centralization of mining, like we discussed, the incentive or the positive in it is that I'm not usurping more data on the blockchain. Okay, what Shriyan is doing is that he's adding another transaction, which means more data. So my transaction, it has less data because it's only the parent transaction that has to be broadcasted. It's only the parent transaction that will be on the blockchain. It's only the parent transaction that the nodes have to store. Now, what Shreyan has done is that he has attached a child transaction. So the data that blockchain has to store and each node has to store is the parent transaction plus the child transaction. So there is also a drawback in using mechanisms that pump the fee on the Bitcoin mainnet, which is that in most cases you will have to add a transaction to bump the fee, which means more data for the blockchain. So there might be some situations where even out of band fees would be preferred because they economize the usage of data on the blockchain. That is what is broadly discussed here, the drawbacks and also some benefits of out of band fees. So
So
any observation?
recently,
Yeah.
yeah. Hi. So recently, Mempool came up with a premium service in which you can pay them beforehand, and there's like a time window of 1 year, or I think a few months, and then they will bump the fees for your transactions. And I think those are out of bound transactions. So Mempool.space has relationships with big miners, and now if you broadcast a transaction that Mempool.space is aware about, and using that service, they will pay the miners out of band so that your transaction gets processed beforehand compared to other transactions in the mempool. So I think that's a very real example of how out of band is probably more incentivized than paying endogenous fee. So I am still wrapping my head around how that is a threat to mining decentralization, because I still believe that's game theoretically not a problem, because the incentive in Bitcoin for mining to be decentralized is just that miners accept fees for including transactions in the block space. So either you pay it through the network fee or either you pay it out of band. It should still work out because there's enough miners who can now open shop and accept out of band fees. But yes, I think it's still a real contract that we are seeing in lifetime only in the last few months, that mempool.space is incentivized to have that relationship with the big miners and not necessarily with somebody who has 2% hash rate. Because now mempool.space is taking that risk, right? When you pay them $250 a year to include your transaction, they are taking that risk that when they pay out of band fee to the miner, that transaction will be included to serve its customers. So that risk is is less when you have that contract with a big miner.
So
So
I
I
have
see
two
the
observations,
yes.
Shreyan. Firstly, if I understood correct, you said that out of bound payments, how are they a threat to decentralization? Was that your query, or do you believe they're not
Yes,
a
I'm
threat?
still understanding. I am
Right.
still
So
not sure. I'm understanding how it's that threat.
cool. So let's say you decide to make an exogenous out payment. All right, your transaction is languishing in the mempool because it has a low fee. Now you decide that I want to call a miner. I want to pay them in dollars or whatever, and tell them to include my transaction in a block. Now there are two miners. Let's say one miner has a 25% or a 30% hash rate, and there's one miner who has 1% hash rate, and you know both of them personally. So it's obvious and incumbent that you will obviously call the person who has 25% hash rate and pay them to include your transaction in the block and not the 1% guy, right? Because the chances of the person with 25% hash rate to get your transaction mined are much, much higher than the chances of the person with 1% hash rate, right? You agree to that?
Makes sense. Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that what will happen is that people will start contacting these big players who have 25% hash rate, 30% hash rate, 25% hash rate, and the miners that have 1%, 2%, 3% hash rates. These miners will be pushed out of business. You know what will happen? People will intentionally put a very, very, very meager fee. Let's say if the estimated fee is let's say 100 sats per V byte, they will pay a fee of 1 sat per V byte on the mainnet. And because they know anyhow they're going to call the miner and pay the miner. So what's the point in even paying the estimated fee? They will pay a ridiculously low fee for the sake of it, and they'll call the miners outside the network and pay the miners, right? Now, what this will do is that A, the small miners will be deprived of exogenous or outer band fees because nobody is calling them outside the network. B, they won't even be incentivized to mine on the network because intentionally people are now using very, very low on net fees because they intend to bump it outside the network. So the small miners will not be incentivized to mine the blocks that are on the network using the implicit fee, nor will anybody contact them outside the network to pay a fee. And this will obviously push them out of business. And slowly and gradually, these people who had 25% hash rate will have 30, will have 35, will have 40, and then we'll be left with 5 or 6 big players who can invest millions and millions of US dollars in the infrastructure. And this is a scenario very similar to the to nodes. Like I mean, like most Bitcoin maximalists were championing the cause of small blocks, and the reason was that if you increase the block size, then the infrastructure that you will have to procure to store the entire blockchain will be very cost intensive, and then like people like common plebs will not be able to afford to run a node. It's only the big players that will be afford to run a node, and thereby only a handful of people will have the node. So this is very similar to that. By paying out of bound fees frequently, you will push out the small miners from the network. If it happens once in a while for a valid reason, then it's understood. Like for instance, your child transaction has a very high data and you don't want to put so much of data on the blockchain, then in that situation maybe you can call in and make a payment. But to make it a habit or something that is frequently done, will definitely centralize uh, Bitcoin mining. So I hope now you get it. If you have any questions, let me know.
Right, I agree. That was a good explanation. And I think there will be more sophisticated ways of doing that anyway. So you wouldn't have to contact miner every time you broadcast transaction. You can have a contract already that you pay a premium for that service of being able to pay out of band. So it will be like a discounted version because you are paying them for 1 year or 2 years. So mempool.space is already doing that. And I see the concern that this could quickly just eliminate any small miners because any company taking that service on their as a risk for that to as a risk to serve their customers will not be incentivized to have the contract with any small miners. So I see the
True.
concern and the problem here.
And did you mention that the time that mempool.space have stipulated is 1 month?
I think yes. So I remember reading about it. I think 3 or 4 months ago, and mempool.space has included this that you can now, if you can connect your node to mempool.space, or if you, I don't think you need to connect your node. You just need to give the transaction ID, and you can pay mempool.space beforehand through a premium service. And if now they will take the cost of paying the miner out of band and get your transaction included, even though your network fee is lower than rest of the transactions in the mempool. It's like you're paying mempool.space and not the miners. And through that, it's like a third party service provider who is now ensuring that your transaction gets mined. So it's like an
I
out
mean,
of band transaction
like I understand the concept and it
contract
completely
with
makes sense,
mempool.space.
but the only thing bothering me is why would somebody want to make wait for 1 month? I mean, like what use case would it be that you broadcast a transaction and you wait for 1 month to get it mined?
No. So it's like you already pay mempool.space $250 per year, and throughout that year you can use the service to have the fee, have the transaction included. So say I pay mempool.space for 2024. Now, if I make a low fee transaction and I want mempool.space to bump the fee, I'm some business who regularly send payments to vendors or my employees, and now have the subscription with mempool.space, which is much cheaper for me than contacting out of band miners, as in doing it on my own. And now, if I do it through mempool.space, I'm only paying $250 or some lower amount because mempool.space use economies of scale. They have thousands of customers willing to pay for the service. have the ability to take that risk that even if Shreyan is using the service a lot, then some other customer who might not be able to, who might not need the service a lot, they are able to um, run their operations by paying mine out of hand. Does that make sense of how
Yes,
through
now,
mempool
now it
networks
does.
it's
I
much
mean,
more cost efficient for somebody to
like what you intended to say initially is that as long as the subscription period is valid, I mean, any transaction that gets stuck because the fee is low,
yes, it's like I just have to
the
press button on their app and they can
right,
pay the miner out of fee and bump the fee of my transaction exogenously.
you're right, yeah, got it. So yeah, let's move forward. Implications of exogenous fees on safety, scalability, and costs. Peter Todd's post also noted that existing designs such as LN anchors and future designs that use ephemeral anchors require each user to keep an extra UTXO in their wallet to use for essential fee bumping. Because creating UTXOs costs block space, this reduces the maximum number of independent users of protocol by half or more in theory. It also means a user can't safely allocate their full wallet balance to their LN channels, which worsens the LN user experience. Finally, using CPFP fee bumping or attaching additional inputs to a transaction to pay fees exogenously requires using more block space and paying more transaction fees than paying fees directly from a transaction's input value. That is endogenous fees, making it more expensive in theory, even if other problems were not a concern. So one more criticism of exogenous fees that Peter Todd comes up with is that he gives an example, or this is an example of a lightning channel where you cannot allocate your entire channel balance in the form of liquidity. You always have to keep some balance in reserve just in case you have to attach a child transaction. Now, let's say what happens is that you decide to broadcast a commitment transaction. Okay, now you decide to broadcast in a lightning channel, you decide to broadcast a commitment transaction. Now that commitment transaction is not getting mined because the fee is too low. Not generally, but this is how the protocol works in a lightning network. On the lightning network, when you create a commitment transaction, that is when you stipulate the fee. Now you might broadcast that transaction 10 days, 15 days, 1 month after the commitment transaction has been created, but the fee was already stipulated when the commitment transaction was created, and it's impossible for you to guess what would be the estimated fee when you actually broadcast that commitment transaction. So it's possible that when the commitment transaction was created, you stipulated a fee of X sats for virtual bytes. But when you are broadcasting it, the estimated fee is 1.5x sats for virtual bytes. So what do you do now? In this situation, you will have to attach a child transaction to your commitment transaction to bump the fee. Okay, that surplus 0.5x fee that is gone up. You need to attach a child transaction which should have a fee of 0.5x so that your transaction gets included in a block. For this, what you'll have to do is you will have to keep some amount of your liquidity in the channel in reserve, so that just in case your commitment transactions fee is not adequate, you will have to allocate that reserve liquidity as fee to the child transaction. So what this does is that, the CPFP, what CPFP in the Lightning channel does is that it prohibits the channel participants from using their entire liquidity, because they always have to allocate some liquidity as a reserve just in case they have to use a CPFP. This is another criticism of exogenous fee. So everybody got this particular criticism, or any questions, any observations? Cool. So we move forward. Ephemeral anchors introduce a new pinning attack as described in last week's newsletter. Peter Todd described a minor pinning attack against users of ephemeral anchors. For a commitment transaction with no pending payments, that is HTLCs, an unprivileged attacker could create a situation when an honest user might have to pay 1.5x to 3.7x more in fees to obtain the fee rate they intended. However, if the honest user chose to be patient instead of spending extra fees, the attacker would end up paying some or all of the honest user's fee. Given that zero pending commitment transactions don't have any time lock dependent urgency, many honest users might choose to be patient and get their transaction confirmed at the attacker's expense. The attack also works when HTLCs are used, but it costs the honest user less to break free and can still result in the attacker losing money. So this is basically a griefing attack which we covered in detail in the last week. Um, Basically, I mean, if there are two partners in a lightning channel and one of the partners decides to act malicious, what they can do is they can use an anchor output, which we discussed in detail last week, which is a, I think even during the lightning session, we discussed briefly what an anchor output is. Briefly, it's a zero value, zero fee, uh, UTXO that pays to an opt-through script which anybody on the network can redeem and attach a child transaction to it and bump the fee of that child transaction in order to get that anchor output mined. So in this situation, what an adversary can do it because it pays to an opt-through script, anybody in the network can access that and attach a high absolute fee but a low fee rate child transaction to that anchor output. And the only way now for the person who has broadcasted the commitment transaction to redeem that UTXO is to pay a fee, either to pay a fee which is higher than what the attacker is willing to pay, or to wait till the attacker's transaction gets mined. So this is a griefing attack. The attacker does not gain anything. The attacker is only trying to harm the network and its participants. And this is known as pinning attack. So basically, what's a pinning attack? Here it's mentioned pinning attack. What's a pinning attack? A pinning attack is basically an attack that makes fee bumping very cost incentive. I'm sorry, very cost intensive. So basically, what you do is you bump the fee of a transaction in a scenario where two or more people control a UTXO. One person can bump the fee of the transaction to such an extent or in such a manner that it becomes very difficult for the other people who also own that UTXO to pay a fee higher than what the attacker has paid, and they have no option either to pay a fee higher than that of the attacker or wait till the attacker's transaction is included in a block. This is covered in great detail last week in a post that Peter Todd made, which this is referring to. If anybody is interested in reading this in detail, they can go to last week's newsletter, and then from there you'll find another link that takes you to Peter Todd's post in which he mentions how this entire griefing attack, pinning attack might happen, and the different scenarios that the person who's been attacked will have to go through. So this is another criticism of exogenous fee. Here's an
Just a quick
alternative that,
question.
sure.
So when the attacker has mined the transaction, is there some scope that the person, the honest user, can still use that output, or do they have to compete, the attacker and the honest user, for fee on the anchor output?
The
Is there some?
output, the commitment transaction will only and only go to the person who deserves it, right? So if let's say Alice and Bob have a channel, Alice broadcasts a commitment transaction. The UTXOs in the commitment transaction will only go to Alice. But what Bob is trying to do is, A, he will make Alice suffer by making Alice pay a more fee to unlock the anchor output. B, Alice will have to wait till Bob's high absolute fee and low fee rate transaction gets mined. So the money in any case will go to Alice. Bob cannot steal the money. That is why this is called a griefing attack. A griefing attack is an attack where the attacker is only trying to harm the network or its participants, and he has no other incentive. So anybody who's an adversary of the Lightning Network or who has enmity towards Alice is just trying to harm Alice. He'll not gain any of the UTXOs. He just harm Alice by making Alice pay more fee to access the UTXO quickly, or he will make Alice wait for a longer period of time because he has attached a child which has a high absolute fee but a low fee rate, and the transaction is mined based on the fee rate. So that is all the pinning attack is. The pinner does not get any UTXO. The person is only trying to harm the network and its participants.
Right.
So if the participant is okay waiting, then the pinning attack will have no significance.
Yeah, no significance. It's just that they'll make Alice suffer by making her wait. That's it.
Okay.
And if just in case Alice needs to access those bitcoins quickly, it's an emergency, whatever situation, then Alice will have to pay a higher fee.
Got it. Got it.
Right? So we move to the next section. Now there's an alternative that Peter Todd suggests. An alternative, use endogenous fees with prescribed incremental RBF bumps. Peter Todd suggests and analyzes an alternative approach, signing multiple versions of each commitment transaction at different fee rates. For example, he suggests signing 50 different versions of the LN penalty commitment transaction at fee rates starting at 10 sats per virtual byte and increasing in each version by 10% until a transaction paying 1000 sats per virtual byte is signed. For a commitment transaction with no pending payments, that is HTLCs, his analysis indicates the signing time would be about 5 milliseconds. However, for each HTLC attached to the commitment transaction, the number of signatures would increase by 50 and the signing time would increase by 5 milliseconds. TBAS, that's Bastian Tentier, linked to a previous discussion he had started about a similar approach. Although the idea may work in some situations, Peter Todd's post noted that endogenous fees with pre-signed incremental fee bumps were not a satisfactory replacement for exogenous fees in all cases. When the delays required for pre-signing commitment transactions contain multiple HTLCs are multiplied by the several hops on a typical payment path, the delay can easily become more than a second and, at least in theory, extend to delays of more than a minute. Peter Todd notes that the delay could be reduced to roughly constant time if the proposed SIG-hash any output opcode APO were available. Even if the delay was a constant 5 milliseconds, it's possible that could lead to forwarding nodes using endogenous fees earning less forwarding fees than nodes using exogenous fees due to anticipated effects of LN payers eventually making redundant overpayments that will economically reward faster forwarding over slower forwarding, even when the difference is on the order of milliseconds. An additional challenge would be using the same endogenous fees for the pre-signed HTLC success and HTLC timeout transactions, even with APO. That would naively imply creating n-square signatures, although Peter Todd notes that the number of signatures could be reduced by assuming the HTLCX transactions would pay a similar fee rate to the commitment transactions. There was an unresolved debate about whether endogenous fees would result in an excessive amount of capital being reserved for fees. For example, if Alice signs fee variance from 10 sats per virtual byte to 1000 sats per virtual byte, she must make decisions based on the possibility that her counterparty Bob will put 1000 sats per virtual byte variant on chain, even if she wouldn't pay that fee rate herself. That means she can't accept payments from Bob where he spends the money he will need for the 100,000 sats for virtual byte variant. For example, a commitment transaction with 20 HTLCs would make 1 million sats temporarily unspendable. That's 400 US dollars at the time of writing. If endogenous fees were also used for the HTLC X transactions, the temporarily unspendable amount of for 20 HTLCs would be closer to 4.5 million sats. That's 2,050 US dollars. By comparison, if Bob was expected to pay his fees exogenously, and Alice wouldn't need to reduce the capacity of the channel for safety. So this is an alternative. The gist of this paragraph that I just read, it's an alternative suggested by Peter Todd for encouraging endogenous fee. What he suggests, I mean, all of us are aware about how, at least on the surface level, about how Lightning networks work, right? You have a commitment transaction that you sign, and just now we discussed that when the commitment transaction is signed, you allot a certain fee to that commitment transaction. Now, you might not immediately broadcast that commitment transaction. You might broadcast that commitment transaction in the future, and it's impossible for you to precisely predict what could be the acceptable fee at the time when you broadcast that commitment transaction. So in this situation, you have an option of A, attaching a child to that commitment transaction later on using the anchor output mechanism. But what that does is that it adds extra data to be stored by all the nodes. And the second option is that you pay out-of-band fees by getting in touch with the miners, which leads to decentralization. So Peter Todd has suggested an alternative where he suggests that instead of signing one commitment transaction for each channel update, 50 commitment transactions should be signed, and each commitment transaction should have an increment of 10% of the fee. So let's say your first commitment transaction has a fee of 10 sats per V byte. Then you sign the second, the third, the fourth, and the 50th, and the final commitment transaction will have a fee of 1000 sats per virtual byte. When you're trying to broadcast this commitment transaction, you see what the estimated fee is. If it's 10 sats per virtual byte, you furnish the first commitment transaction. If it's 100 sats per virtual byte, you furnish the 10th commitment transaction, and it's 1000 bytes per sats per virtual byte, you furnish the 50th commitment transaction. So for each update, there will be 50 commitment transactions with 50 different fee rates such that every commitment transaction will have an increment of 10%. And when you're broadcasting that transaction, you will see the estimated fee matches with which commitment transaction, and you will broadcast that specific commitment transaction. What this does is that it prevents you from attaching a child, thereby usurping the data that every node has to store. And secondly, it also prevents out of bound fees. Now there are various pros. There are various pros and cons to it, which were discussed in the debate. It's a long debate if you go through it. But yeah, that's what Peter Toth suggests, that instead of having one commitment transaction, we should have 50 commitment transactions for every transaction update, and each commitment transaction should have a 10% fee bump. And then whatever fee is appropriate, we furnish that specific commitment transaction. So the gist of Peter Todd's suggestion, I hope, is clear. Or any questions?
Uh, I mean, to me, it seems if we are broadcasting 50 commitment transactions every time around, just to make sure that, endogenous fees are the only fees, that seems a little overkill. I am not very sure if this is a great proposal. This makes sense, but is it something that people are seriously considering, or are there other alternatives that people are like more keen to pick up?
Firstly, we won't broadcast all the 50 commitment transactions. We just create 50 commitment transaction, and only one commitment transaction will go on the mainnet, that which is suitable to go on the mainnet. Where the issue arises is that you will have to sign every commitment transaction. So you have to broadcast just one commitment transaction, but you have to sign 50 commitment transactions. So the process of signing increases 50 times. Uh, like every commitment transaction might have either one HTLC output, it might have two HTLC outputs, it might have 10 HTLC outputs. So if it has only one HTLC output, then the average time that will be required to sign 50 commitment transactions is predicted by Peter Todd as 5 milliseconds. So within 5 milliseconds, you can sign 50 commitment transactions. But if there are, so in that situation, it's fine. It works. If there's only one HTLC, then you can sign 50 commitment transactions within 5 milliseconds. But if there are multiple HTLCs, if there are 5, 10, 15, 20 HTLCs in a commitment transaction, then the time required for signing will go up exponentially. And there were some examples given here that the time in theory might even take 1 minute. So this is a proposal. Prime FSC, from what I understand, is that if the commitment transaction is straightforward, has only one time locked transaction, then yes, it can be applied. But if there are multiple if there are multiple HTLCs, then the time required for signing will go up, and then a lightning invoice might even take almost, in theory, a minute to get fulfilled, which is absolutely not practical. We don't want to wait for 1 minute to get the confirmation of a lightning invoice.
Just to
And
recollect,
also,
just to
yeah,
recollect, like commitment transactions are transactions wherein the channel is opened, right? So, two parties come together, put in their bitcoins, open the channel. That's what commitment transactions are. So, where does the
no,
HTLC
that's
come
the
in?
funding transaction.
Oh, that's
Commitment
funding transaction.
transaction is,
Oh, okay, okay,
yeah, commitment transaction is a closing channel transaction.
okay, okay,
And that
got it.
also forced close. If one person wants to force close, he has a commitment from the other person, so he can forcefully close the channel. That's a
Got it.
commitment transaction.
Mm,
And also the thing is, like, if you have 50 commitment transactions and varying from 10 sat per virtual byte to 1000 sat per virtual byte, you will also have to keep that amount of liquidity aside. So you will basically need to keep a lot of, generally in an ideal situation, if the estimated fee when you're creating a transaction is 10 sats per virtual byte, you probably keep 10 sats per virtual byte in spare for a CPF fee. But here, because your fee ranges from 10 to 1000, you will have to keep 1000 sats per virtual byte aside, and you cannot use that much money. So, like examples are giving, if there are 20 HTLCs, if there are more HTLCs, you might even have to keep $450 aside uh, to cater a very high fee environment, which is not feasible. Like in a Lightning network, nobody wants to keep $450 aside
mm.
just in case they need to do a fee bump. So
Yep.
yeah, the nitty-gritties and how the community responded to it. If anybody wants to go into it in detail, and they can go to this debate section and see what people or the community as a whole had to say. Peter Todd will most probably join Bitcoin Optech next week because I was listening to the podcast and they said we've been inviting him for the past 2 weeks and he was traveling, so he could not join. So maybe he'll join next week, and let's see if he has any thing to say about it.
Great
Okay,
summary by
so
the
we just
Faisal. Yeah, go ahead.
nice. Yeah, just a
Let me
conclusion.
just clarification. Hey, am I
Yeah,
audible?
yes, no, yes, now.
Just a quick clarification. So when you are using a payment path which is not direct, so the paragraph mentions that it will require more STLCs, and is that I just needed some clarification if number of STLCs increase as a payment path has multiple hops.
See, actually, in real world, it might not always happen that Alice is directly connected to Bob. Okay, if Alice wants to make a payment to Bob, maybe Alice is connected to Faisal, Faisal is connected to Shreyan, Shreyan is connected to Bitalu, Bitalu is connected to Ruru is connected to Saurabh. Okay, and then Saurabh is connected to Bob. Okay, and all these people have HTLCs among them. I have an HTLC with Shreyan, Shreyan has an HTLC with Saurabh, Saurabh has an HTLC with Bitalu, who has an HTLC with Ruru, who has an HTLC with Bob. Okay, so there are so many HTLCs, and all these commitment transactions need to be furnished. So, I mean, it just
Right.
goes on higher exponentially, and all commitment transactions that have 50 variants, and all 50 variants have to be signed. So the amount of time that we need to sign will, in theory, might even be 1 minute if there are a lot of HTLCs.
Right. But is it not that the immediate sender does not know the entire path to the recipient? So they are only aware of the person that they are receiving from and the next person that they are sending to. So does it
Yeah, that's known as
increase the
onion
price of the
routing.
transaction? Right.
That's called onion routing, basically, yeah, to enhance user privacy. This is basically a concept widely adopted by Tor, and Lightning Network also deploys it. And the CoinSwap protocol, in which Bitshala folks are working, also has an onion routing method, whereas a node only knows its ancestor and its descendant, and nothing else.
Mm, right.
That's right. Just like onion has multiple layers, when you peel it, it comes one layer comes out of at a time. So every node only knows its layer. It can only see its layer. It can see the ancestor and it can see the descendant. Other than that, it cannot see anything. That's why it's known as an onion routed path, being analogous to how an onion is peeled.
Yes.
Cool. So I just conclude this.
And
Overall conclusions. Well, discussion was ongoing at the time of writing. Peter Todd concluded that existing usage of anchor outputs should be phased out due to the above mentioned minor decentralization risks. New anchor output support should not be added to new protocols or Bitcoin Core. Ellen developer Rusty Russell posted about using a more efficient form of exogenous fees in new protocols to minimize the concern about out of band fees. In the Delving Bitcoin thread, other developers working on Ellen, VP transactions, and ephemeral anchors defended the usefulness of anchors, and it seemed likely that they would continue working on V3 related protocols. We will provide updates in future newsletters if anything significant changes. So Peter Todd is of the opinion that anchor output should not exist at all, and then there were people who were defending it, who were defending the anchor outputs. And Rusty Russell posted about using a more efficient form of exogenous fees and new protocols. So, like, this was a suggestion made by Peter Todd that we covered. Rusty Russell also had his suggestion. I did not go through it. Maybe we can, if anybody's interested, they can go through it, but it's still in the discussion phase. So cool. Yeah. Now this is the second section. We go through it. Ellen Symmetry Research Implementation, Gregory Sanders posted to Delving Bitcoin about a proof of concept implementation he made of the Ellen Symmetry protocol, originally called L2, using a software fork of Core Lightning. Ellen Symmetry provides bidirectional payment channels that guarantee the ability to publish the latest channel state on chain without a need for penalty transactions. However, they require allowing a child transaction to spend from any possible version of a parent transaction, which is not only possible with a soft fork protocol change such as SIG hash, which is only possible with a soft fork protocol change such as SIG hash any route. Sanders offers several highlights from his work. Yeah, basically this is a proposal by Gregory Sanders. Uh, it was originally called L2, and most people still refer to it as L2, but its name currently is Ellen Symmetry. That's what it's called. So now we've, even during our mastering the lightning sessions, and even during today's session and in the previous two sessions, we've spoken extensively about commitment transactions and how if somebody, for a malicious actor, tries to broadcast a revoke transaction, then the counterparty can penalize them by furnishing a penalty transaction. Okay. Now there are some people who believe that this mechanism is very complicated, and what should be done is that the moment a transaction is revoked, it should not exist anymore. It should become obsolete. It should become invalid. So there is absolutely no possibility for a cheater to furnish a revoked commitment transaction, and there is no need for a node to constantly monitor the network for a revoked commitment transaction and then come up with a penalty mechanism. This is too much of work. So we don't want revoked commitment transactions to exist. The moment they are revoked, they should stop existing, they should become invalid. So when they become invalid, there's no need for the person that's being cheated to apply a penalty because you can't cheat. The moment a transaction becomes revoked, it becomes invalid. So the only option for you is to furnish the latest one. And then there's no need for the person who's being cheated or who could have been cheated to apply the penalty mechanism. So this is what the L2 implementation is. Okay, this is what it suggests. And this is like an article in Medium. I'll share the link later on so you all can go through it. It talks about unidirectional channels, and then it talks about bidirectional lightning channels. Then it talks about L2. Okay, and then I mean the drawbacks that could be of bidirectional channels, which is again one person cheating the other, and how it was currently being tackled by the penalty mechanism, and how that is too much of work and that should not happen. So here is a brief diagram. What this does is that basically, as you can see, this is a settlement transaction. Okay, the one that TS0, this is the settlement transaction, and TU1, this is the update transaction. The moment there is an update transaction, the previous settlement transaction becomes invalid. As you can see, it is light in color. Okay, then there's a second update. The moment there's a second update, the second settlement transaction becomes invalid. There's a third update, the third settlement transaction becomes invalid. And then when there are no updates, the final settlement transaction gets furnished. So this is basically the first commitment transaction, the second commitment transaction, the third commitment transaction, the fourth commitment transaction. In the Lightning Network implementation, we call them commitment transaction. Here, these guys are referring to them as settlement transaction. So now this is the latest settlement transaction or commitment transaction, and all the previous commitment transactions, one, two, three, they become irrelevant, they become obsolete, they are invalid. So they cannot be broadcasted anymore. So there's no question of cheating. So if anybody tries to cheat, it's not possible because the revoked commitment transactions are invalid now, and only the relevant and only the latest commitment transaction is valid now. So there's no question of cheating. How this exactly works, I'll share the article. It's a very long article and it's a very nice article. I thoroughly encourage everybody to read it. Okay, so this is basically what it does. It applies a CSV, check sequence verify, of 10 blocks to the settlement transaction, and the updated transaction does not have a time lock. So the updated transaction gets mined immediately and before the settlement transaction. That's how this whole thing works. It's a long article, and it also talks about a new flag. All right, sig hash no input, because this is an update transaction, this is an update transaction, this is an update transaction. Okay, now this update transaction spends from the setup. What is the setup? The setup is the 2 of 2 multisig wallet, which has a funding transaction. So at the first update, this is trying to spend from the funding transaction. At the second update is also trying to spend from the funding transaction. The third update is also trying to spend from the funding transaction. Now there are 3 updates. How do you publish them to the Bitcoin mainnet? So there is a new flag in proposal SIGHASH no output where you sign a transaction but you do not assign a TXID to it. So at this stage, if you want to go on chain, you put the TXID of this transaction at this stage, then you put the TXID of this transaction at this stage, then you put the TXID of this transaction. So this is a soft fork. It will require a soft fork for the L2 or the LN symmetry protocol to be implemented. So the gist of it is that people who are working on L2 or LN symmetry believe that old commitment transactions should not exist. And any cheater should not have the provision to try and publish or broadcast an old commitment transaction. The moment a new commitment transaction is signed, old commitment transaction should become invalid. And there's no need of the penalty mechanism at all, because it's not possible anymore to spend the old commitment transaction, which makes a lot of sense. And it's very interesting proposal. And this is a huge upgrade over the current implementation of the Lightning Network. So this is broadly what L2 is. I'm sure everybody got the gist of what L2 is, right? We're just trying to get rid of the revoked transactions. All right.
Yes, I think SIG has any playbout is quite interesting. I'll have to see how it works to revoke the previous commitment transactions.
I was wondering how far are you guys on the mastering lightning thing? As in, I remember there was chapter 4 when I dropped out and it had uh, that like you had to do some bit of programming, but like chapter 5, 6 and 7, you guys have covered. And how technical are these chapters? I don't think they're very technical, right?
Can you like to take this and rethink where we've reached and what we've covered?
Me? Okay. So
Yeah.
yeah, we have covered till chapter 7. I think midway till chapter 7, almost to the conclusion. And yes, it's mostly non-technical. So you only need to understand Bitcoin primitives and some revocation penalty, which is primitive to LN.
Yeah.
But that's pretty interesting and it's pretty straightforward to understand. So chapter 6 and 7, I think, cover most of the essential part of how LN works. And we will continue with chapter 8 from tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think if you want to join, you can join straight away and we can give a quick brief about how payment channels or revocation and penalty mechanism works in LN.
Yeah, I did the
It's,
book
it's
two
pretty
years
interesting.
ago, but like when Fazil explained L2, I felt like I need to revise LN. It's been some time, but yeah,
Right.
I'll join in
It is
tomorrow.
actually not explained at least till chapter 7, and I also find it fascinating because it's actually very different from how LN currently works. So, the entire point of penalty mechanism is to be able to punish the malicious party who publishes a old revoked transaction. So, L2 is like a different paradigm to how to implement Lightning, and
Hmm.
I'm not sure how it works with the new opcode. It's not a new opcode, I think it's just a flag, right? I'll have to
Yeah.
read up on how it works.
Let me see. Yeah, I think it's a flag. No, yeah, I think it's a flag, but this is a proposed software. Why exactly? L2 is not usable because it relies on a proposed signature scheme, sig hash no input, which has yet to be adopted. But because it is not penalty based, there is no risk of you losing funds. So sig hash no input. Yeah, it's a signature
We have
scheme. So
sighash prev output, any prev output, right? I think that's what is being used right now.
no, that can be used. I don't think that's being used. I think we've covered it in the article. I think that's being used because in that case, you can sign any of the previous commitment transactions.
That I think that.
Peter Todd notes that the delay could be reduced to roughly constant time if the proposed. No, on the Lightning Network, I don't think we are using that because he says Peter Todd notes that the delay could be reduced to
Okay,
roughly
so
constant time if the
this is
proposed
also
sig
not
hash.
available. This opcode is also not available right now.
Yes. And
Right.
Lightning does not use any other opcode or any new primitive in Bitcoin. So there's no
Yeah, yeah,
new
yep,
opcode or new technological
yeah.
primitive that we need to understand. It's just a incentive structure you create for the revocation penalty mechanism. And
Right.
that comes with the cost of running your node 24/7 and maintaining channel state data.
So yeah, we try and cover this in 10 minutes. So basically, this is a monthly activity. Like these people conduct a monthly Bitcoin core PR review club, and then they have some questions on the review club. These are like very basic questions. So there was a suggestion made by Nicholas Gerber, and he says that the suggestion is called Nuke adjusted time. He says that adjusted time should not exist on the Bitcoin network. I will briefly go through what is MTP, median time passed, and what is network adjusted time. So MTP is basically the time that the entire Bitcoin network follows. It's it's time that is common for all the participants of the network. How is this calculated? You look at the uh, timestamp in the block header of the previous 11 successfully mined blocks. So you go to the previous 11 successfully mined blocks, you look into the header, there's a field which has a timestamp, you take the timestamp, okay? Now you have 11 headers with all of them having timestamps in their block headers. You take the median time passed, okay? Now the average, the median, which is the sixth block. So you go to the sixth block, you see what the timestamp is, and that is the time of the Bitcoin network. And that is the minimum amount of time that the 12th block should have for it to be valid. All right. So we've taken the last 11 blocks. For the 12th block to be valid, it needs to have a timestamp which is greater than the sixth block. That is the median of the previous 11 blocks. If it has a timestamp lesser than that of the sixth block, which is median time passed, then it is invalid because a block cannot have a timestamp which is lesser than another block which was mined like 5 blocks ago. So that's the lower bound. That is the minimum timestamp that a block should have for it to be considered valid, and that's referred to as the median time passed. Now that there's the lower bound, there also has to be an upper bound, and the timestamp of a block to be considered valid should be between the lower bound and the upper bound. What's the lower bound? We just discussed. What's the upper bound? Every node has its own time. Okay. Now every node when you set up a node, it basically sets up connections with outbound peers. the list of first 199 outbound pairs to which a node connects is taken, and the median time of those nodes is calculated. So out of those 199 outbound pairs, we take the 100th node, which is the median. We look at its timestamp, and then we basically see the offset between our node's time and the time of the 100th node, and we add it. It can be negative, it can be positive, to get our offset. Now, for instance, the time of my node is, let's say, 10,000 seconds. Okay, just imagine a virtual number. My node is 10,000 seconds. So I will gather a list of 199 outbound nodes to which my node is connected. Okay, and then I'll go to the 100th node, which is the median, and I will see what is the time of that 100th node. It could be minus 10,000 seconds, it could be 10,050 seconds, it could be 9,950 seconds. Okay, so I'll see what the offset is. If my node says 10,000 seconds and the 100th node, that outbound node that I'm connected to, says 1,050 seconds, then the offset is 50 seconds positive. And if the 100th node says 9,950 seconds, then the offset is 50 seconds negative. Okay, so what you do is you add this offset to your node's time, and then you add 2 hours to it. That is your upper bound. Okay, so for any block to be valid, it has to have a block's time which is in between the range of the MTP, the median time passed, and the network adjusted time plus 2 hours. The network adjusted time is the time of your node and the offset of the 100th node of the 199 list that I just spoke about. Okay, so between this range, the block time or the timestamp should be for a block to be considered valid. So basically, what Nicholas Berger suggests is that we don't need this network adjusted time. We don't need to connect to, you don't need to query 199 outbound peers and then find the median time, because there's a chance of eclipse attacks. If these 199 nodes are compromised, then they will feed wrong information to you. So you should not use this mechanism, and rather you should stick to the time of your system. Whatever system on which you're running a node, if you're running a node in a computer, then your computer's local clock is your network adjusted time, and the block that you have mined cannot have a timestamp that is in excess of 2 hours of the time of your local system, because nobody would intentionally compromise their own local system. And if they compromise their local system intentionally with a false timestamp, then there's a mechanism that detects it. Okay, and then that notifies you that your local system's time is not valid, because it's either too ahead in the future or too before in the past. So this is what he suggests, that we don't need to query 199 nodes. We just stick to the time of our system and add 2 hours to it for the upper bound. The questions are very small, the answers are also very small. We'll try and wrap this up in 5 to 7 minutes. Is it necessary for block headers to have a timestamp? If so, why? Answer: yes, the timestamp is used in difficulty adjustment and to validate transaction time logs. These are basically two primary use cases of having a timestamp. It is used in difficulty adjustment, and it is also used to determine time locks, like transactions that have a future time lock. How do you know when that time lock has lapsed? You refer to the timestamp. What is the difference between median time passed, MTP, and network adjusted time? Which of these are relevant to the PR? MTP is the median time of the last 11 blocks and is the lower bound of block timestamp validity. Network adjusted time is calculated as a node's time plus the median of the offset between our time and that of a random selection of 199 of our outbound peers. This median can be negative. The network adjusted time plus 2 hours is the maximum valid block timestamp. Only network adjusted time is relevant to this PR. Okay, so this PR does not talk about getting rid of MTP. It only talks about getting rid of network adjusted time and instead using the time of your local system. Why are these times conceptually very different? MTP is uniquely defined for all nodes synced to the same chain. There is consensus on time. Network adjusted time can vary across nodes. Okay, so like I said, MTP is common for all the nodes, because MTP is derived from the timestamps of the block that are on the blockchain, which is same for all the nodes. Whereas network adjusted time is different, because every node is connected to a different 199 peers, which will give it a different set of information, and its offset will be different. So network adjusted time is specific to every node, whereas MTP is common for all the nodes on the network. Why don't we just use MTP for everything and scrap network adjusted time? MTP is used as the lower bound of block timestamp validity, but it can't be used as an upper bound because future block timestamps are unknown. This is self-explanatory. We have lower bound, we also need an upper bound. We can't have MTP as both the lower bound and the upper bound. While limits enforced on how far off a block header's timestamp is allowed to be from the node's internal clock. And since we don't require exact agreement on time, can these limits be made more strict? The block timestamp range is restricted so that malicious nodes' ability to manipulate difficulty adjustments and lock time is limited. These kinds of attacks are called time warp attacks. The valid range can be made more strict to an extent, but making it too strict could lead to temporary chain splits since some nodes may reject blocks that other nodes accept. Block timestamps don't need to be exactly correct, but they need to track actual time over the long run. So why do we need this lower bound? Why do we need this upper bound? It's obvious so that if a person puts a timestamp that is way behind in time, then what they can do is they'll spike up the difficulty artificially, and if they put a timestamp way further in the future, then they will artificially reduce the difficulty. So that is why there needs to be a limit which is relevant and in relation to the real time, so that the difficulty is adjusted appropriately. Before this PR, why would an attacker try to manipulate a node's network adjusted time? If the node is a minor, to get it mined blocks are rejected by the network, or to get it to not accept a valid block so it keeps wasting hash rate on an old tip. Both of those would give an advantage to a competing miner. To get the attacked node to follow the wrong chain, to cause a time lock transaction to not be mined when it should be, to perform a time dilation attack on the Lightning Network. Like, what incentive would somebody have in putting a false timestamp? That is what the question is, and there can be various incentives. Some person wants to harm you, and thus they can put a timestamp that is way in future, thereby preventing your time lock transactions from getting validated. Somebody might just want to harm, might just want to harm the network, and that is why they might put a block that has an invalid timestamp so that the block gets rejected, and the hash rate of the network is wasted. So this is like a griefing attack where you don't have an incentive, but you just want the network to suffer. Prior to this PR, how could an attacker try to manipulate a node's network adjusted time? Which network messages would they use? An attacker would need to send us version messages with manipulated timestamps for multiple peers that they control. They would need us to make more than 50% of our outbound connections to their nodes, which is hard but much easier than completely eclipsing the node. So I think Bitalu came up with this question like. Uh, why what is the problem with network adjusted time? Why is the PR reviewer suggesting that it should be dumped? Because if you are connecting to 199 nodes and asking those nodes for what the time of the system is, if a malicious attacker controls 50% of those nodes of your outbound connections, which is like 100 nodes, then there is a very high possibility of you calculating a wrong network adjusted time. So instead of relying on external nodes, you rely on your own system's time. SPR uses the node's local clock as the upper bound clock validation time rather than network adjusted time. Can we be sure that this reduces esoteric attack surfaces rather than increasing them? Discussion ensued with no clear resolution as to whether it's easier for an attacker to affect a node's peer set or its internal clock, using malware for NTP fakery, for example. But most participants agreed that the PR is an improvement. So, like, there was a debate whether it's difficult for an attacker to perform an Eclipse attack and control 50% of the outbound peers that you are in contact with, or whether it's easier for an attacker to just get into your system and manipulate your system's time. There was a debate which is more easier, with some people saying no, the Eclipse attack has a high possibility, and some people saying that no, manipulating your system's clock is more easy. Does this PR change consensus behavior? If so, is this a soft fork, a hard fork, or neither? Why? Because consensus rules can't consider data from outside of the blockchain, such as each node's own clock. This PR can't be considered a consensus change. It's just a network acceptance policy change, but that doesn't mean it's optional. Having some policy rule limiting how far a block's timestamp can be in the future is essential to the security of the network. So if this PR at all gets approved, it will not amend any of the consensus protocols of Bitcoin Core. Rather, it's just a node policy rule. You will have to amend your personal nodes policy, and the system will not be affected as a whole. Which operations were relying on network adjusted time prior to this PR? Test block validity, create new block used by miners to build block templates, and can direct fetch used in P2P layer. The variety of these uses shows that the PR doesn't just affect block validity, but there are other implications which we need to validate. So these are some of the operations which rely on network adjusted time, and they will get affected either for the better or the worse, depending on what the outcome is, if the network adjusted time is nuked and is replaced by the system's local time. There's just one notable code in documentation this week, and this is in fact what we discussed last week only, and that the LND implementation of Lightning Network now has uh, changed the min final CLTV expiry delta from 9 to 18 as recommended by Bolt 02 for terminal payments. This value affects external invoices that don't supply the min final CLTV expiry parameter. The change remedies the interoperability issue discovered after CLN stopped including the parameter when the default of 18 was used, as mentioned in last week's newsletter. So the default min final CLTV expiry delta as proposed in Bolt 2 was 18. LND was using 9, so now LND has also upgraded it to 18 in compliance with Bolt 2. That's a single notable code and documentation change for this week, and we've covered the entire newsletter, I think, in 1 hour. We started 10 minutes late. So, yeah, anything anybody would like to share, any questions, any insights, any anecdotes, please feel free to go ahead.
This was great. This was great session.
Yeah, it's so much. It's actually a great explanation. So I just have one question about the maximum time limit on the block validation. So if 2 hours is the policy acceptance by the network, so is there, how does it mitigate the possibility that if there's no block being found in the next 2 hours, then if a miner finds that block and propagates to the network, then now node will reject that block because 2 hours was the upper bound. So
Right. Yeah. What you're trying to say is there's a lower bound and an upper bound. No, I mean upper bound is basically the network adjusted time plus 2 hours. Okay. So what's the network adjusted time? I'm running a node. Okay. So my node has its own time. Okay. So if I successfully mined a block. Okay. Network adjusted time, remember, is specific to every node. It's not the unique time on the blockchain. Okay. So my node will, right now what it'll do is my node will query 199 first outbound peers, right? When I set up my Bitcoin Core node, I started establishing connections with other nodes, right? Now there are inbound peers and there are outbound peers. Inbound peers are those who establish connection with you. Outbound peers are those with whom you initiate establishing a connection, right? So you have, let's say, 1,000 outbound peers, 1,000 nodes with whom you've connected. You take the list of the first 199 nodes, okay, and then you find the median, which is the 100th node. Now you look at the time of the 100th node. You query the 100th node, you ask the 100th node what's your time, okay, and the 100th node tells you, hey, this is my time. Then you see your own time and then compare it with that 100th node's time, okay, and then you adjust the offset. Okay, you adjust the offset and plus you add 2 hours to it, okay, and that is the block validation time. So the offset cannot be of 2 hours. I think there's a limit for the offset. I think if it's more than 60 minutes, then that block is not, I mean, that node information is not considered relevant. Either you move on to another node or you kick that node out, take the 200th node and make a new set of 199 and then query the 100th node, or you just go to the 101st node. I'm not very sure about how it works, but there is a limit. The offset cannot be more than 60 minutes or 70 minutes. Okay. So
okay.
It's even if you add 2 hours to it, no, it's 2 hours as per your node. I mean, 2 hours ahead of your node's time. So when you mine a block, okay, your node has a time, right? So that time you generally add in the timestamp. So it should not be more than 2 hours as compared to your own node's time, not the system's time. It's your node's time. Your node will obviously tell the time when it mined the block. It cannot predict a time in the future. There can be slight offset, but not more than 2 hours. If it's more than 70 minutes, it's ruled out. 60 or 70.
All right. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. So we'll wrap up for the day, guys.
Yep, great work, Basil. Yeah, amazing.
So thanks a lot for showing up, guys. And I'll see you all. We'll see each other next week. All right.
We can
Bye. Take
we
care.
can discuss it in the
Yeah.
chat whether which day suits us. I think going by existing commitments, Tuesday might be the best, but we can still discuss and debate.
So you'll commence the discussion. You'll post.
Yeah, I'll
And then
post.
we'll follow.
I'll post and then we can all discuss.
All right. So like, where do you intend to post it? In the reading club section or in the general for everybody's opinion? What's the plan?
I think I was thinking of doing it in reading club itself. But like if you want it to be discussed in general, we can move it to general. Happy to hear feedback from other folks, Mango Elephant and Bitalu, if some other
Yeah,
day suits them
exactly.
better, because we are the ones who are
Exactly.
regular, right? So, Bitalu and
Exactly.
Mango Elephant, is there any other day that you would like this discussion to happen? Monday, Tuesday, or yeah, these are the days available because Friday is occupied with chain code force. So these are the options.
Because guys, we believe that Sunday most people have their family commitments and also we're looking for a weekday.
I don't mind either days. I'm mostly free during after it.
Okay.
Same goes for me. Yeah.
Perfect. Cool. We'll just check it once and then maybe do it Tuesday.
Yeah, and my suggestion, either we decide among ourselves, or if you decide to put it to the community, my suggestion would be to go into general because there are people who show up even though once in a while who are not in the reading club section. So that would be better. That's my suggestion. You take it up with Raj.
Okay, cool. Will do.
All right, cool. Good night, everyone. Enjoy your dinners. Bye.
Yep.